Disaster movies are nothing new, since humans have been imagining great apocalypses ever since we learned how to write. Ones like Atlantis or Noah's Ark, where whole civilizations are destroyed. So, why do we find the fall of great civilizations and even our whole species so enjoyable and intriguing? The truth is that we enjoy it because it is exciting. Our modern world is in many ways utterly boring and bland, so an impending disaster is a break from that mundane routine. That's why disaster movies manage to be appealing, because instead of having to live out an actual disaster, we get to enjoy that same fantasy from the safety of our couch. The mere idea of a break from our uninteresting life is enough to allow us to remain ignorant to how horrible a disaster like that would actually be. Because our modern world is incredibly taxing, maybe not for all, but for most people, days, weeks, and years go by without so much as a blink of an eye. We live in a world of constant consumption and stress, so the simple idea of finally having something exciting happen is incredibly appealing. But the actual disaster is usually only a very small part of the movie, since it usually happens at the very end, where the story hits its ultimate culmination. Therefore, the apocalyptic event itself is only a tool that is used to create the right conditions for the story. And this is where we enter the main appeal of these films, and that is the idea of the calm before the storm. Because the disaster is only so engaging by itself, what makes us really care is the feeling we gain looking at our world before it is destroyed. The ability to exist in the modern world, but with the newfound perspective that makes you appreciate every little thing. In our day-to-day lives, nobody pays any attention to how nice it is that you can peacefully go to a store and buy food, because in a disaster scenario, it all goes away. Therefore, when we watch the main protagonists buy supplies at a convenience store before the disaster has really started, we have the ability to view it not from the perspective of just another boring day, but rather from the perspective of the last opportunity to enjoy something so simple. The knowledge of knowing that everything will wash away gives us a new viewpoint, and it is that which makes it that much more engaging to watch. Meaning that when you watch Jeff Goldblum play chess at a park in New York City, or John Cusack go on a road trip to Yellowstone, it is the knowledge that everything will go wrong that makes those moments special and interesting. The calm before the storm gives you a true sense of peace, because it is a psychological phenomenon that disaster movies use to reel you in. That's why the second everything is actually destroyed, you lose most of the interest in the film. A case example is the 2005 movie War of the Worlds, starring Tom Cruise, where the movie is incredibly intriguing and enjoyable to watch up to the halfway point, because after we see the world literally fall apart, we too lose all engagement in the film. And this is exactly what separates good and bad disaster media, because it is really hard to keep viewers engaged if the culmination of the disaster is done wrong. One way writers get around it is to have the disaster happen quickly, which we see in movies like Bird Box or the second installment of A Quiet Place, where they then pan the main plot into a post-apocalypse, which works, but then it isn't a disaster movie in the traditional sense anymore, since the main theme shifts from surviving the immediate disaster to surviving the apocalypse in the long term. Therefore, the best way to do it is to have the main disaster, the main culmination of the story, happen at the very end. A great example of a movie which did this perfectly would be Greenland, where the writers introduced the disaster gradually. We see the destruction happening, but on a relatively small and distant scale. Therefore, using that, Greenland keeps the stakes high, meanwhile managing to not give away that calm before the storm feeling. So the reason that feeling is able to persist is because we follow the characters ourselves. We perceive everything through the eyes of the survivors, giving us, the audience, a sense of safety. The only reason people fantasize about disasters is because we are easily influenced by what is commonly known as survivorship bias, where just because the guy on the screen did it must mean we could do it too. And when we look at people in real life who have survived disasters, we only really get to hear their perspective. We never really know what the people who ended up perishing thought and felt, so we never have to really imagine ourselves in that position. So when we see a regular boring person become the main hero, it makes us also believe that we could do the same. This is commonly known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people constantly overestimate their abilities. When we watch these movies, we see that in some capacity, surviving a massive disaster is possible, so we overestimate how much we could actually achieve, and while sitting on our couch, we can relate to the main protagonists, since they too, at some point, were sitting on a couch watching TV. And this is what keeps these movies semi-believable and engaging, because if we couldn't relate to the main characters in some way, that sense of ability would break. You would stop thinking that you can survive it and be confronted with the reality of death. In real life, when a disaster happens, people panic and everything goes badly really quickly. Nobody wants to witness actual disasters because they are horrifying. Even though at some capacity humans do like watching buildings collapse and things blowing up, it's not the point. That is why we find disaster movies appealing, but not actual disasters. Because in a movie, everything is fantasy. The casualties are only fictional and they don't provide any emotional impact other than that of moving the story forward. Therefore, disaster movies are an incredible tool to show the fragility of our world and the insignificance of the things we perceive as incredibly important. They allow us to understand what truly matters and what is just filler. When you watch entire cities and even our entire planet just crumble away, it makes you reflect on what truly matters, even if you don't do it in a serious, thoughtful way, because it still has a subconscious impact. And yes, I know that a lot of disaster movies are actual disasters. Therefore, when I'm referencing them as deep and thoughtful works, it might seem weird, but I really want to emphasize how hard it is to make a good disaster film, because they have to blend sci-fi with reality, and that is an incredibly hard thing to do. One of the worst offenders is Moonfall, a movie which by most rights should have been an enjoyable watch, given the intriguing concept, but turned out to be a total disaster. Or even the famous 2012, which, while being semi-decent and pretty iconic, still has a lot of issues, especially surrounding its realism and the plot itself. Because while the Earth being microwaved by the sun is an intriguing concept, the way humans approached it was definitely illogical by most standards. Therefore, when I make a video about the deeper concepts behind disaster films, it may be hard to take too seriously. And to that, I just want to point out the good disaster movies which really sell the genre, at least to me. Ones like Greenland, Independence Day, Deep Impact, Twister, and even Titanic, which take this concept of an objectively bad thing happening and turn it into something that is pleasant to watch, without relying on adrenaline like horror movies do. And that is why we enjoy disaster movies and why they are so interesting. Because for me personally, these films will always have a special place, even the bad ones, because there's nothing better than just sitting down and enjoying a truly badly fun film. Once you mentally adjust yourself to not take them too seriously and are able to ignore the issues, it becomes almost as fun as watching funny cat videos at 3 a.m. But in all seriousness, I think that the disaster genre as a whole unearths a very specific and core part of humanity. They make us think about not only ourselves, but also our society as a whole. And when a disaster is about to happen, you get to see the world through a truly unbiased lens, which is something that you don't get in many other media. For example, Atlantis was primarily an allegory to depict the hubris of great nations and how in the end they all fall anyway. This was one of humanity's earliest myths, and it is one that perfectly captures what I'm trying to say with this video. That no matter how great something is, at some point it always ends. If you enjoyed the video, let me know in the comment section down below. I would love to hear what you think about this topic, or maybe you have unanswered questions or suggestions. In any case, check out the channel for more in-depth videos like this. Live long and prosper.